It is generally accepted in English proverb that where there's a will, there's a way. Lord Peter Wimsey, upon encountering the late Mr. Septimus Thrip's will, signed in a distinctly tremulous hand and, more importantly, in pencil, felt constrained to observe that where there's a will, there is very often no way at all, and certainly no justice if the thing's been dashed off on hotel stationery after a fish supper. The remark, made half to himself and wholly to the consternation of the county coroner's clerk, echoed slightly in the dim morning light of Thrip and Bastable, solicitors and commissioners for oaths, whose oak-panelled office bore the unmistakable whiff of camphor, old ink and unresolved litigation. The body of Mr. Thrip, respected solicitor, noted Rotarian and lifelong opponent of decimal coinage, was discovered in his private study above the office shortly after 7 o'clock on Tyne, a rain-drenched Tuesday morning in Dorset. He had been found by his underclerk, a red-lidded youth named Derek, who possessed the curious gift of being both inappropriately deferential and alarmingly uninformed. Derek had come early to prepare the Sanborn Trust's charity dispersal. Docket, a document Wimsey was told existed but never quite believed, and found his employer supine on the turkey rug beside a cracked decanter and a bronze letterweight shaped like Lady Justice without her blindfold. The police, those honest and unconvinced stewards of the rural crime scene, had initially suspected a stroke or heart seizure, Mr. Thrip being of a certain age, portly, and constitutionally averse to salad. However, a cursory glance at the man's wrists, the faint linear bruise above the collar, and the curious arrangement of the room, particularly the broken clock on the mantelpiece, stopped precisely at 10:17, invited what the superintendent called inquiries beyond the obvious. It was at this juncture that Lord Peter Wimsey, lately visiting the region for the dual purposes of attending a minor cousin's wedding and inspecting a rare folio of Gower's Confessio Amantis at the Sanborn Priory Library, had the misfortune, or good fortune, depending upon one's moral alignment, to wander into the affair. "I only meant to borrow a map," Wimsey had explained cheerfully when found by the constable thumbing through Thrip's calendars of wills on a side table. "But then I noticed the will itself, unsigned. No, worse than that, signed in pencil. In pencil, my dear superintendent. That's not a testament. It's a doodle, with delusions of grandeur." "But how did you even get up here, sir?" asked the constable, still faintly pink from having demanded credentials Wimsey had provided with theatrical slowness, alongside a lapel carnation and a quotation from Timon of Athens. "The front door was ajar," said Wimsey blandly. "And your man at the desk was engaged in a struggle with a tea-urn. The British legal system will no doubt survive, but only just." Now, as the rain fell in grey diagonal sheets outside, Wimsey stood over the solicitor's desk, eyeing the oddments of Thrip's life with a kind of gentle contempt. There was a pair of pince-nez glinting with disuse, a glass paperweight containing a spray of dried heather, and a half-written letter addressed to someone named A.E. Lumsden, Esco, the latter bearing a watermark from the Grand Albion Hotel, Bournemouth, and dated rather suspiciously only 4 days prior. What bothered Wimsey, what always bothered him, wasn't the death itself. Death, after all, was a certainty. It was the narrative that lacked plausibility. A solicitor of Thrip's meticulous reputation, one who kept old retainer contracts in triplicate, and had once, reportedly, refused to witness a will because the testator had used a fountain pen with turquoise ink, would no more sign his own testament in pencil than he would have hosted a séance in the vestry. And yet, the will was there. Short, clear, and exceedingly favourable to one Miss Nella Thrip, the solicitor's orphaned niece and current companion, who, according to Derek, the underclerk, never liked the place much and was always wanting to do something with the theatre. "Well," Wimsey said softly to himself, inspecting the crack in the window pane behind the solicitor's desk, "if this were a play, the curtain has just gone up, and I suspect we're in for a rather thin third act unless someone produces a ghost or a confession, sir," said the constable behind him, who had been standing patiently and, judging by the look of him, attempting to process the last 4 sentences. Wimsey turned with a faint smile. "Nothing, Sergeant. Only thinking aloud. But tell me, was the body cold when found?" "Yes, my lord. Quite cold. Been dead several hours," the doctor said. "And the fireplace?" "Unused. Hearth swept." "Curious," murmured Wimsey. "September rain. A man of sedentary habits and yet no fire lit. What else was he doing at 10 past 10, I wonder? Aside from dying, I mean." He stepped toward the battered desk drawer and gave it an experimental tug. It resisted, then opened with a reluctant sigh. Inside was a mess of correspondence, a crumbling cigar, and a theatre program from The Woman. In white, dog-eared at Act 3, Wimsey smiled without mirth. "Well, if this is to be a performance, we'd best see if the cast is ready." And so began the curious case of the will that was signed in pencil, the solicitor who forgot to light a fire, and a niece with theatrical ambitions and, according to some, a temper. Wimsey descended the narrow stairs of Thrip and Bastable with the careful detachment of a man tiptoeing through another's psyche. The solicitor's office, now sealed in its hush of dust and death, had offered just enough detail to provoke rather than clarify. Rain hissed against the windows, washing Sandbourne High Street in pale grey streaks. Outside, the scent of wet stone mingled with the sweet, faintly sick odour of wood smoke from the bakery chimney across the square. The underclerk, Derek, blonde, watery-eyed, and as nervously brittle as a candle in the wind, was waiting at the foot of the stairs with a sort of wounded eagerness. "Beg pardon, my lord," he blurted. "If you've questions, I'll do my best." Wimsey regarded the young man over the rim of his monocle. "Questions, my dear Derek, are an unavoidable consequence of homicide, especially when mixed with legal stationery. You found Mr. Thrip, I believe?" "Yes, sir. Just before 7. Came early, as I said, to prepare the docket. I went up, as usual, to leave the morning tray." "Tea?" "Indian, sir. He didn't take China. Said it made him bilious." "Most things did," Wimsey said absently. "Did you find the door locked?" "No, sir. Just closed. He always kept it shut if he was working." "I knocked, got no answer, so I went in. Found him, there, on the floor." "Anything unusual? Smell of gas, disturbed furniture, open windows?" Derek shook his head, pale lashes fluttering. "Only the broken decanter, sir, and the paperweight. I think he must have knocked it off his desk." "You think so?" Wimsey's tone was pleasantly speculative. The weight was some feet from his chair, and his right temple was marked by it, not the left, which one would expect from a fall if he struck his desk. No matter. Carry on." "What did you do then?" "I ran straight down and fetched Mr. Bastable, that's his partner, and then the constable. Nobody touched anything, sir, promise. Very commendable." Wimsey flicked a speck from his sleeve. "And Miss Thrip? Where, was she?" "Oh, she doesn't live here, sir. Got her own place just off Sandbourne Crescent. Only came in later when the news got out. They'd had a bit of a row, sir, I think." Wimsey's eyebrows lifted a degree. "Really? About what?" Derek looked embarrassed. "He didn't say, not to me. But she was in a state yesterday afternoon. I saw her leave the office crying, and he was banging about after. Threw his ledger on the floor. I picked it up later." "Derek," said Wimsey solemnly, "you are shaping up to be an uncommonly observant office boy. Take care, or you'll be a chief inspector before 30. Flushing. Faintly, the young man managed a hesitant smile. Wimsey offered a perfunctory nod and stepped into the street, lifting his umbrella against the slanting rain. Miss Nella Thrip's lodgings were found in a modest block of flats, red-bricked and studiously anonymous, with an entrance half concealed, behind a laurel hedge and a brass bell that had not been polished since Edward VII passed through Dorset on a shooting tour. A pert landlady with an eye for lapels let him in, all the while eyeing Whimsy's spats with a blend of suspicion and admiration. Miss Thrip herself opened her door in a dark green dressing gown, mascara smudged and hair pinned up in haste. She was 27, angular, and wore grief like a stage prop, too heavy and a little off-center. "I suppose you've come from the police?" she asked, stepping aside. Her voice was low with a faint rasp. Possibly cigarettes, possibly tears. "I've come from reason," said Whimsy cheerfully, which is almost the same thing, though it tends to dress better. He seated himself uninvited in an armchair littered with theatre reviews and an open box of black magic chocolates. A tumbler of sherry sat abandoned on the mantelpiece beside a cracked ceramic bust of Queen Victoria. "I understand," he began, "that you and your uncle had words yesterday." Nella stood stiffly by the fireplace, arms folded. "Who told you that, Derek?" "Derek's a born witness. He'll make someone's barrister a very trying day. But it's not an accusation, Miss Thrip. Only curiosity." She hesitated, then exhaled. "He wouldn't support me. The grant fell through the Sanborn Arts Fund. I asked him again for an advance, just 6 months to move to London and try for the theatre properly. He said it was sentimental nonsense, that the stage was no place for a Thrip. That's rather sweeping, though I dare say the West End might be improved by a touch of Dorset respectability." She ignored the jibe. "He was cruel. He could be, you know. Everyone thought he was so proper, so kind to church charities and club dinners. But he was mean, in the real sense, mean-spirited. He said if I left Sanborn, he'd disinherit me completely." Whimsy nodded, as if confirming something already suspected. "And yet, the will in question, scribbled though it was, names you sole heir." She blinked. What? That's impossible. He said he'd changed it. Months ago." "Did he? And yet the document on his desk, dated only 4 days prior, is rather unequivocal on the matter, unless he meant to replace it, or someone replaced it for him." Silence hung between them like a damp towel. "Miss Thrip," Whimsy said gently, "how well do you know a Mr. A.E. Lumsden?" Her eyes narrowed. "Tony, he was a friend. We acted together in the village productions. Uncle hated him, said he was beneath us." "Is he beneath you?" "He's a decent man," she said tightly. "Trying to start a repertory company in Bournemouth." "Ah, the dangerous seed of culture in a commercial wasteland. No wonder. Your uncle disapproved." He rose, brushing non-existent lint from his knee. "Miss Thrip, one final thing. Did your uncle keep any personal papers here? Anything you might have seen in the past few days?" She shook her head. "Only what he brought when he visited. Sometimes he brought accounts to go over, receipts and drafts, but never anything official." "Pity. Well, I thank you for your honesty and your taste in chocolates." He exited without waiting for protest, stepping out into the drenched street as the bell in the distant church tower struck 11. He paused, watching a milk cart pass, the horse's hooves making a soft clatter on the wet stones. In Thrip's death, there were too many tidily convenient things. A sudden will benefiting the estranged niece, a silent, empty house in a town where everyone had heard the row, but nobody mentioned it unless asked, and a solicitor who had every reason to be exact, yet left his legacy on a sheet of pencil-scribbled paper, unsigned by witness, and dated in the same ink as a letter found from a Mr. Lumsden at the Grand Albion Hotel. Too convenient. He turned up his collar and made his way toward the vicarage. The Reverend was an inveterate gossip, and if Thrip had kept up his weekly bridge, the vicar's drawing room would be the true records office of Sanborn. And besides, Whimsy had always found that men who quoted Corinthians in the pulpit were even more forthcoming over sherry at noon. The vicarage, a pleasant if somewhat prosaic residence cloaked in ivy and late spring shadows, stood opposite the square's modest post office. Its garden was a neat patchwork of herbaceous borders and prim gravel paths, maintained with a religious zeal that only a clergyman's wife and a housekeeper could muster. The Reverend Audley Gray, a broad-shouldered man with a face as ruddy as a baked apple and a fondness for red waistcoats, was seated by the window when Wimsey arrived, half-finished cup of tea steaming at his elbow. "Peter, what an unexpected pleasure, and such a grey day for it," the vicar said, rising with surprising agility. Come in, come in. I hear dreadful things about poor Septimus. Murder, I believe." "Not murder exactly," Wimsey said, smoothing his gloves. "More like a death in suspicious circumstances, which in a place like Sanborn is practically the same thing." Gray motioned to a leather wing-back chair, and Wimsey sat, setting his umbrella aside. "Tell me, Peter, what's your theory so far? I gather the deceased was a man of some precision." "Indeed. A solicitor who could make a clerical error in triplicate, or so the reports say. But what intrigues me most is the will. The—" Vicar raised an eyebrow. "The will, signed in pencil no less, and dated but not witnessed. In other words, a document hardly worth the paper it's scribbled on. Yet it names his niece, Miss Nella Thrip, as sole beneficiary, a neat reversal from previous arrangements." Gray nodded thoughtfully. "Nella's a theatrical sort, as I understand it. That's caused some raised eyebrows among the local worthies." Wimsey smiled faintly. "Theatre and Dorset do not always mingle well, Reverend. What else have you heard? Any rumours circulating at the parish?" Gray folded his hands. "Oh, the usual. That Septimus was growing irritable in his old age, quarrelsome even with his partner, Mr. Bastable. Some say he was overly harsh with his niece, who fancied herself a lady of the stage. There's talk of a dispute over finances, an advance or loan that was refused, and whispers that the niece was seen leaving the solicitor's office in tears the day before his death." "A reasonable dramatis personae," said Wimsey, "but circumstantial as a fog in October. What of Mr. Bastable himself?" "Quiet as ever, efficient, but not a man one would call warm. I believe he arrived shortly after the body was found." Wimsey tapped his fingers on the armrest. "I'd like to speak with him. But before that, Reverend, there's a detail that nags me. The clock on the mantelpiece in Thrip's study stopped at precisely 10:17. Gray nodded. "Curious, isn't it? We had the constable's sergeant inspecting that very clock. The official line is that it stopped because it was knocked, presumably by the deceased himself during some struggle or collapse. Except," Wimsey murmured, "Mr. Thrip was found cold and motionless when discovered, no signs of a struggle, and the clock stopped at 10:17, but the body was not found until well after 6 in the morning the following day. So the timeline is, problematic?" "Exactly." Wimsey's eyes gleamed with the familiar spark of inquiry. "We have a man who apparently died sometime late at night or early morning, but his mantel clock, often an unreliable witness, is telling us a different story. It stopped at a time that conflicts with the presence or absence of certain individuals. And the door was merely closed, not locked. Someone had free access." Gray adjusted his waistcoat. "Did you note the broken decanter?" "Yes, broken near the body, but with no visible shards to explain a fatal injury. No blood, no signs of a struggle. It suggests a stage scene or a lapse in attention." The vicar frowned. "Could it be simply an accident? A sudden stroke? A fall? The clock knocked over in the process?" Wimsey inclined his head. "Possible, but unsatisfying, and there is more. The will's date and the letter from a certain A.E. Lumsden of the Grand Albion Hotel, Bournemouth, suggest a recent upheaval. Who is this Lumsden? A theatrical man, a friend, or possibly more, of Miss Thrip. His reputation is modest, but earnest. He's trying to establish a repertory company, which has not endeared him to Mr. Thrip. That much is clear." Gray sighed. "So the niece, the theatrical suitor, the irate uncle, and a will that may or may not be valid. It sounds like the makings of a melodrama, Peter. Indeed. But melodrama is a luxury of the stage, Reverend. In real life, the motives are subtler, the actors less straightforward. I intend to visit Mr. Bastable next. The partner, the colleague. The man left to pick up the pieces. The vicar stood, smoothing his cuffs. I shall arrange for him to be available. Meanwhile, I'll speak with some parishioners. Quiet folk who might have noticed odd comings and goings. One never knows. Wimsey took his leave, stepping out into a drizzle now mingled with the first chill of evening. His mind turned over the facts like stones in a stream, searching for something smooth and revealing beneath the rough surface. Back. At the solicitor's office, Mr. Bastable was indeed waiting, an austere figure clad in a frock coat that seemed decades out of fashion, and spectacles perched like cautious sentinels upon his nose. He greeted Wimsey with a measured nod, as if greeting a relic rather than a guest. Lord Peter Wimsey, I believe, he said in a voice brittle with restrained emotion. I trust you have the authority to inquire. Only curiosity, Mr. Bastable, Wimsey replied, settling into a chair opposite the man. You were the first called after the body was discovered? Yes. Derek summoned me. I arrived about 7:15. Found the office disturbed. Mr. Thrip lying, as you know. Bastable cleared his throat. A shock to us all. Septimus was a careful man, punctilious almost to a fault. He would not have left such loose ends as a will signed in pencil. Exactly. That is what puzzles me. Do you know if he intended to revise his testament recently? Bastable's gaze flickered. He mentioned something about his niece's situation. He was reluctant, but finally conceded to see if he could help her. I gathered from his notes that he had some doubts about the validity of the new will, especially as it was drafted in such haste. And Miss Thrip's theatrical connections? Displeased him greatly. He considered it a frivolous pursuit. Unworthy of the Thrip name. Wimsey folded his hands. Did Mr. Thrip receive visitors on the night of his death? None that I am aware of. He dined alone, as usual. I arrived late myself. Too late, it seems. Were you aware of any quarrels between the two of you? Any disputes? Mr. Thrip was exacting. I confess at times we disagreed, primarily over business decisions, but nothing that would suggest this. Bastable gestured vaguely to the silent office beyond. Wimsey's eyes sharpened. Did you notice anything unusual about the office that evening? Anything out of place? Bastable hesitated. Now that you mention it, the door was ajar when I arrived, though I had locked it behind me earlier that day. Someone else had access? Apparently. But nothing was stolen, nothing missing, except perhaps, as you noted, the clarity of events. Wimsey nodded thoughtfully. I must inspect the premises more thoroughly. A few questions remain unanswered. Soundproofing of the rooms, the alignment of clocks, the exact time of death. May I accompany you? By all means. They moved back upstairs, where Wimsey began to methodically examine the study. He tapped the mantel clock gently. A stopped clock can be a clue, or a red herring, but here it is both. He checked the broken decanter, noting the pattern of the shards and the faint residue of brandy. No sign of poison. The window was slightly ajar, the latch unlatched but intact. Open windows, he mused aloud, are invitations to wind, whispers, or the occasional rat, but seldom murderers. Bastable watched him silently, the lines about his mouth hardening. Wimsey turned to the desk. Tell me, did Mr. Thrip use a particular writing instrument? A pen he favoured? A fountain pen invariably, Bastable replied. Fine nib, blue-black ink, never a pencil, never. Curious indeed. The will was signed in pencil. That suggests someone else, perhaps forced his hand or forged a signature. Forgery. Bastable's voice cracked with disbelief. Not necessarily, Wimsey said, but certainly a possibility. We must also consider the timeline, when the will was signed, when Mr. Thrip died, and when the will was last seen. He paused, studying. The Underclerk Derrick's notes, which lay beside a sheaf of receipts, and a theatre programme from the woman in white, dog-eared at actor Thrip. Miss Thrip's affinity for the stage, her connection to Lumsden, the broken clock, and the ajar window, each a thread in the tapestry. And yet, the image is incomplete. Bastable exhaled and sank into a chair. I wish I had more to offer, Lord Peter, but the truth may be stranger than we imagine. Indeed, Mr. Bastable, and I intend to find it. The day waned, and the shadows lengthened across Sanborn. The pieces had been laid, the players tentatively identified, but the game was only beginning. Wimsey's mind raced with hypotheses and half-formed deductions. He would need to revisit Miss Thrip, interview the obstinate Underclerk again, and perhaps most importantly, learn more about the elusive Mr. A.E. Lumsden. For now, he stepped out into the gathering dusk, the faint scent of theatre grease and damp stone mingling in the cool air, and pondered the curious case of the will signed in pencil. The evening thickened with a gentle mist as Wimsey made his way through the narrow streets of Sanborn, the cobbles slick beneath his polished boots. The theatre district, a cluster of modest playhouses and fading posters, was quietly shutting down for the night. The flicker of gas lamps cast a jaundiced glow on the faces of late patrons and street vendors, while the distant hum of an organ drifted from the dimly lit Grand Albion Hotel. Wimsey's thoughts were restless, untangling the strands of his inquiries with a surgeon's precision. The incongruity of a will, signed in pencil, the misaligned clocks, and the open window all suggested deliberate orchestration, yet the motive remained elusive. Was it the niece, desperate to secure her inheritance? The diligent but aloof Mr. Bastable, or some other hand unseen yet cunning? Arriving at the Grand Albion, Wimsey paused briefly to observe the entrance. It was an unremarkable facade, faded paint, a modest brass plaque, and a revolving door that creaked faintly with disuse. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of stale cigars and lavender. A porter, a thin man with a hawkish nose and tired eyes, directed Wimsey toward the hotel's proprietor, A.E. Lumsden. Lumsden awaited in a cluttered office above the lobby, a room redolent of cigarette smoke, leather-bound scripts, and theatrical posters yellowed with age. The man himself was slender and sprightly, with a mop of unruly chestnut hair and eyes that darted nervously as if scanning for unseen spectators. "Lord Peter Wimsey," he said with a slight bow. "I trust my humble establishment hasn't brought you too far from more agreeable pursuits?" "Not at all," Wimsey replied, settling into a chair. "I find theatres and mysteries often share a curious affinity. Both conceal secrets beneath layers of artifice." Lumsden smiled thinly. "Quite so. Now, how may I assist you in untangling whatever dramas have found their way here?" Wimsey produced the sketch of the will. "I understand you are acquainted with Miss Nella Thrip?" Lumsden's expression tightened. "Acquainted? I might say entangled is more accurate. She's a force of nature, brilliant, tempestuous, and maddening. I've been trying to help her establish a repertory company, but the financial backers are less enthusiastic. Septimus Thrip was less than charitable when it came to supporting her ambitions." "Did you have any dealings with Mr. Thrip himself?" Lumsden nodded slowly. "I met him twice, briefly, a man of stern countenance and rigid principles. He regarded my theatrical aspirations with thinly veiled contempt. Our conversations were polite, but frosty. He feared that Nella's pursuits might sully the family name. Understandable in his position, perhaps. Do you know if there were any recent confrontations or disputes between them?" Lumsden hesitated. "There was one heated exchange, yes, the day before his death. Nella was distraught, and I had to convince her to leave his office. She left in tears, but I never saw the contents of their argument. Did she mention anything about the will? No, at least not directly. But she seemed obsessed with securing her future. This new will, signed in pencil, was a desperate measure, I think, to buy time. Whimsy frowned. Desperation often leads to rash acts, and yet the will's validity is highly questionable. Exactly. I advised her to seek proper counsel, but time was short. Was anyone else present during this dispute? Witnesses? Only the clerk, Derek. But he's a nervous fellow, always skittish around Septimus. I doubt he would risk angering his employer by speaking candidly. Whimsy made a note. Derek's reticence could be a useful foil. And what of your own movements that night? Whimsy asked. Were you in the vicinity when the body was discovered? Lumsden's eyes flickered. I was in my office preparing scripts until late. I didn't leave until well past midnight. Could anyone verify that? Only my housekeeper, Mrs. Milligan. She tends to be reliable. A good character reference is invaluable. Lumsden's gaze narrowed. I sense you suspect more than mere artistic rivalry. Suspicion is the first step towards truth, Whimsy said smoothly. Now, one final question. Have you noticed anything unusual about Miss Thrip's behavior since Septimus's death? Lumsden sighed. She's shattered, but also strangely composed. There's a fire in her eyes, a determination that unsettles even me. She's made several attempts to secure the old will, but it appears to have vanished. Whimsy thanked Lumsden and stepped back into the damp air. The pieces were accumulating like notes in a discordant symphony, yet the melody remained elusive. Returning to the vicarage, Whimsy found Reverend Grey and the housekeeper, Mrs. Althea Ponce, in quiet conversation over tea. Mrs. Ponce was a small woman, sharp-eyed and taciturn, with the bearing of someone accustomed to managing more than just the household. Mrs. Ponce, Whimsy began, you have known the Thrip household for some time? Nearly 15 years, my lord, since the late Mr. Thrip's father passed. I've seen the family through many storms. Did you notice anything out of the ordinary in the days leading up to Septimus's death? Mrs. Ponce considered carefully. There was a certain tension, yes. Miss Nella came and went at odd hours, sometimes late into the night, and Mr. Bastable, he was quieter than usual, more withdrawn. Something weighed heavy on them all. Did the servants overhear any disputes? Raised voices? Not raised voices, my lord. But whispered conversations, hurried and hushed, the kind that makes one's skin crawl. Were there any visitors to the house after dinner on the night in question? A few, Mr. Lumsden, as I recall, and Derek, the clerk, was quite agitated that evening. Whimsy's thoughts returned to Derek, the nervous underclerk, a man who might know more than he admitted. I should speak with him again, if you have no objection, Mrs. Ponce. Of course, my lord. Derek's lodging is just over the way. I can fetch him. While waiting, Whimsy examined the vicarage's parochial records. Among the usual entries, baptisms, weddings, funerals, there was a curious notation regarding a previous Thrip will, witnessed and dated some years prior. Its contents left Nella Thrip with only a modest sum, the bulk of the estate bequeathed to a distant cousin. The new will, signed in pencil, was a stark departure. The doorbell chimed, and Mrs. Ponce ushered in Derek, a pale and twitchy man, clutching his cap as though it were a talisman. Mr. Derek, Whimsy began, thank you for coming. I understand. The past few days have been difficult. Derek nodded, eyes wide. Yes, sir. It's all been a terrible mess. Indeed. I want to ask you about the night Mr. Thrip died. You were present, yes? I was working late in the filing room. Heard nothing unusual, except a soft sound, like a sigh or a creak. I didn't think much of it. Did you see anyone enter or leave the office? No, sir. The door was closed but not locked. I thought perhaps Mr. Thrip stepped out. And the window, Derek blinked. Left ajar, yes, but I didn't think much of that either. Did you notice the mantel clock? It stopped at 10:17. Derek frowned. No, I didn't see. I was too busy. Did Mr. Thrip have a habit of keeping late hours? Sometimes, especially when preparing wills or legal documents. Whimsy leaned forward. Did you ever see him use pencil to sign documents? Never, sir. Always pen. Why? Because the will signed in pencil is most irregular. Derek swallowed. I can't say more, sir. I'm just the clerk. Sometimes, Mr. Derek, the smallest details reveal the largest truths. I hope you'll consider that. As Derek left, Whimsy remained seated, piecing together the growing puzzle. The clock's halt at 10:17, the open window, the mysterious will, and the fraught family dynamics formed an intricate tableau. Walking back through the village under a sky thick with stars, Whimsy mused aloud. A theatrical niece, a legal partner in shadow, a will of questionable legitimacy, and a death, shrouded in subtle misdirection. The truth waits behind these curtains of circumstance, hidden but never absent. Tomorrow promised interviews with Miss Thrip herself and a closer scrutiny of the timelines. But tonight, the shadows deepened, and the game was well and truly afoot. The morning mist clung stubbornly to the hedgerows as Whimsy arrived at Sanborn Hall, its formidable stone facade muted beneath a pall of damp grey. The heavy clouds seemed an apt shroud for the secrets nesting within the walls, a household still trembling on the edge of revelation and ruin. Miss Nella Thrip awaited him in the drawing-room, seated by a high window overlooking the garden. Her figure was slender and tense, draped in a simple black dress that spoke less of mourning than of resolute austerity. Her eyes, sharp and luminous, held that familiar fire Whimsy had noted the night before, equal parts defiance and desperation. "Lord Peter," she greeted with a slight incline of the head, voice cool but edged with exhaustion. "I trust your inquiries have borne some fruit." "Miss Thrip," Whimsy began, settling into a chair opposite her. "Truth, like a difficult script, often demands patience and careful interpretation. I hope you will indulge me as I unravel the narrative of these recent days." She inclined, her head again, signaling readiness. "To begin, may I ask about your movements on the evening of your uncle's death?" Nella's eyes flickered briefly, but her expression remained composed. "I was at the theatre, rehearsing a scene for a new production. Afterwards, I returned here to find the house strangely quiet." "Did you notice anything amiss? Unusual sounds, visitors, or anything out of place?" She shook her head. "Only that the vicar was present. Reverend Grey seemed perturbed but offered no explanation. A perturbation that would be consistent with the discovery of a death, I imagine. Speaking of which, can you tell me about the will you claim your uncle signed in pencil?" She hesitated, then nodded. "It was a desperate measure. Uncle Septimus was adamant about disinheriting me, but I was certain he wished to provide for my future. The will was drawn hastily, the signature faint and uncertain. I sought his acknowledgement, hence the penciled signature. A curious choice, certainly, given the gravity of such a document. Have you any idea where the original might now reside?" "Only that it was kept in his study. I fear it may have been destroyed or hidden." Whimsy noted the emphasis, but withheld comment. "And your relationship with Mr. Bastable? You appear to share a complicated history." Nella's gaze sharpened. "Robert Bastable is my legal advisor, and for better or worse, the executor of Uncle's estate. Our interactions have been professional, though strained at times. He has his own ambitions, I suspect." "Indeed, Mr. Bastable's motives will be explored in due course. Meanwhile, did your uncle suffer from any ill health or sudden ailments? Only the usual complaints of age, but nothing that would explain his sudden collapse. Whimsy's mind raced. The details aligned with a scenario of subtle poison or induced heart failure. But such a method seemed at odds with the theatrical flourish of an open window and the halting clock. "Miss Thrip," Whimsy ventured, "do you recall the time of your uncle's death as reported by the vicar?" "Shortly after 10, if I remember correctly." "Precisely at 10:17, the time the mantel clock stopped," Whimsy murmured. She gave a faint nod. "Yes, I recall the clock had stopped." A coincidence that grows less plausible with each passing inquiry. "Now, may I ask about the study's window being left ajar?" Nella sighed. "He liked fresh air, even in the chill of autumn. I suppose he opened it to clear the room." "Did you notice the direction of the wind that night?" She looked puzzled. "No, I cannot say. It may be a trivial detail, yet one that will prove significant." Whimsy rose and approached the window, gesturing toward the garden below. "The angle and location of the window suggest that any breeze entering would be cooled by the adjacent ivy and shaded walls. A perfectly natural ventilation, but one that might carry scents or sounds." "Are you implying foul play, Lord Peter?" "I imply nothing until the evidence demands it, but the peculiarities invite examination." Turning back to Nella, he continued, "Your alibi at the theatre, is it supported by others?" She smiled, faintly. "Yes, the cast and crew were present. I was rehearsing the role of Lady Macbeth in Act 3. "Remarkable," Whimsy murmured. "Lady Macbeth, a woman who famously manipulates time and guilt. How apt." Their exchange was interrupted by a discreet knock. Mrs. Ponce entered carrying a tray with tea and scones. Her manner was respectful, but alert, a silent observer of the interplay. "Forgive me, my lord," she said quietly, "but Mr. Bastable has arrived and wishes to speak with you." Whimsy inclined his head and excused himself. The drawing-room fell into a contemplative hush as Nella's gaze followed him with measured curiosity. Robert Bastable was waiting in the hall, his tall frame imposing against the dim light. His expression was inscrutable, a mask polished by years of legal training and cautious calculation. "Lord Peter," he greeted formally, "I understand you are conducting a thorough examination of our unfortunate events." "Indeed, Mr. Bastable. Truth requires no less." "I can assure you my interests align with justice," Bastable said smoothly. "Though I must admit, the suggestion of a penciled will casts a shadow over the proceedings." Whimsy observed Bastable carefully. "And your movements on the night in question?" "I was at my chambers drafting correspondence until late. Mrs. Ponce can attest to my presence. A convenient alibi." Bastable smiled thinly. "Convenient, yes, but truthful. I had no motive to harm Mr. Thrip. My role as executor depends upon the integrity of his estate. Yet you stand to benefit considerably if the penciled will is invalidated." Bastable's gaze sharpened. "A hypothetical that overlooks the many complexities of inheritance law." "True, but it also underlines the necessity of scrutinizing every detail." As they spoke, Whimsy's mind returned to the small, overlooked facts. The disordered desk in the study, the faint scent of almonds lingering in the air, an olfactory hint often associated with cyanide, and the peculiar reluctance of key witnesses to fully disclose what they knew. "Mr. Bastable," Whimsy said, "would you accompany me to the study? There are several aspects of the room that merit closer inspection." Bastable acquiesced with a nod, and together they ascended the grand staircase to the study, where the stale scent of paper and wax candles mingled with a faint trace of something more sinister. Whimsy's gaze swept over the cluttered desk. Open ledgers, half-written letters, and a small, overturned inkwell. The penciled will, conspicuously absent. "The document must have been here recently," Whimsy murmured. "Yet no one has reported finding it." Bastable glanced at the desk. "Perhaps it was removed, or destroyed," Whimsy added quietly. He moved to the window, noting the worn ledge and the thin streaks of dust disturbed unevenly. The window was indeed opened that night, Wimsey concluded. Yet the direction of the wind, west to east, would have blown any scent outward, not inward. Bastable frowned. A curious detail. More than that, Wimsey said, turning sharply. The clock stopped at precisely 10:17, but the mechanism was tampered with, its pendulum locked by a fine thread. This suggests the time of death was manipulated. Bastable's composure faltered for a moment. You insinuate a staged scene. I do, Wimsey replied. And the open window, the penciled will, the halted clock, they are all pieces of a carefully constructed illusion. Bastable's lips tightened. Who benefits from such deceit? That is the question we shall answer in due course. Wimsey's mind raced as he pieced together the inconsistencies. The ticking clock, the open window, the missing will, the delicate sense, all pointed to a scenario more complex than a simple death. As he left the study, the first drops of rain began to patter against the stone mullions, a fitting overture to the unfolding storm of revelation. Back downstairs, he resolved to interview Mrs. Milligan, Lumsden's housekeeper, who might corroborate alibis and perhaps offer insight into the nocturnal movements of those involved. The afternoon waned as Wimsey carefully charted the known timeline, cross-referencing witnesses and piecing together the fragile mosaic of events. Each step revealed yet more shadows, each answer opening new questions. The stage was set for a confrontation not of swords or pistols, but of intellect and subtle cunning. And Lord Peter Wimsey, with his ever-present cigar and unfailing calm, was ready to raise the curtain. The housekeeper's parlour was a snug room on the ground floor, with worn oak beams overhead, and walls papered in a faded floral motif, its colours dulled by time, and many a damp English winter. Mrs. Milligan awaited. Wimsey with the kind of reserve often practised by those who have seen too much but speak too little. Her neat hands clasped a handkerchief folded with precision, and her eyes, sharp as gimlets, betrayed a quiet intelligence beneath the threadbare decorum. Mrs. Milligan, Wimsey began, seating himself by the hearth, you have been at Sanborn for many years, have you not? Going on 20, she replied crisply, since Mr. Thrip took over from his father. I've seen the household through fair times and foul. And on the night of your master's unfortunate demise, Wimsey inquired gently, what can you tell me about the comings and goings? Mrs. Milligan's lips pressed into a thin line. Most of us were in bed early, my lord, save for the usual kitchen staff and Mr. Lumsden, the butler, who had some late duties. And Mr. Lumsden, would you say he is a man of discretion and loyalty? Loyal as the day is long, my lord, though I'll not deny he has a temper that flares like a candle in a draught. Wimsey made a note. Lumsden's temper was a variable to consider. An ill-controlled nature might either conceal or precipitate violent actions. Did you observe any unusual behaviour from the servants that evening? Any whispered conversations, nervous glances? She hesitated. Well, there was talk in the kitchen about the vicar. Some thought Reverend Grey had been behaving oddly, like a man burdened with a secret, the vicar's name again. Wimsey had noticed the man's furtive glances and distracted manner in prior encounters. What sort of secret, Mrs. Milligan? I could not rightly say, my lord. But the ladies in the house speculated he was entangled in some personal matter, perhaps connected to Mr. Thrip's recent arrangements. Wimsey arched an eyebrow. The penciled will, perhaps. The housekeeper nodded, a faint crease appearing between her brows. Miss Nella was very protective of that will, said it was her last hope, though the rest thought it little more than a childish fancy. A childish fancy that may well be the key to this perplexity. He steered the conversation back to the timeline. Did you notice when Mr. Lumsden last made his rounds that night? At about 9:45, my lord. He checked the household, locked up the servants' quarters, and made sure the kitchen was secure. After that, he said he was going to retire early. And did he keep to that? Mrs. Milligan bit her lip. I am not certain. I heard footsteps near the library about 10:10, though whether it was Mr. Lumsden or someone else, I can't say. The time was chillingly precise, close to the moment the clock had stopped. Wimsey's gaze drifted toward the window where the afternoon light waned into early evening gloom. This is a detail we shall revisit. He thanked Mrs. Milligan for her candour and left, feeling the weight of unspoken truths pressing against the fabric of Sanborn's genteel veneer. In the dimming light, Wimsey next sought out the vicar, Reverend Grey, whose nervous energy had not abated since their previous encounter. The man received Wimsey in his modest study, cluttered with theological texts and worn, leather-bound volumes. Lord Peter, the Reverend greeted with a tremulous smile. I gather you continue to puzzle over the mystery. Indeed, Reverend. And your own role in the events remains somewhat unclear. Might we discuss your movements on that evening once more? Grey swallowed visibly. I was at the rectory, preparing a sermon, but I came to Sanborn around 10 upon hearing of Mr. Thrip's collapse. A timely arrival. The household summoned me post-haste. It was a grim scene. Did you speak with Mr. Thrip before he died? Grey's eyes flickered. No. He was unconscious when I arrived. Yet you stayed in the house thereafter? Yes. I remained in the library for a while, composing prayers. I left shortly before the police arrived. Your presence near the library coincides with the footsteps heard by Mrs. Milligan. The Reverend's lips parted, but no denial came. Yes. Wimsey noted the confession with interest. Did you notice anything unusual in the library or study? Disturbed papers, open windows, or misplaced objects? Grey hesitated, then nodded. I saw the study window open. It seemed out of place, given the weather. A detail previously mentioned. Do you know why it was open? No. Mr. Thrip had a habit of seeking fresh air, but I believe someone else opened it after my arrival. And the scent of almonds lingering in the study. Grey paled noticeably. I cannot explain that, my lord. Wimsey's mind connected the scent to cyanide, its notorious aroma. The possibility of poisoning emerged once more, a ghost, haunting the room with cruel subtlety. Reverend, do you have any knowledge of Mr. Thrip's health? Any illnesses or ailments that could be relevant? He was robust for his years, Grey answered firmly. No signs of serious illness. And yet, sudden death. Grey's gaze fell. I fear this was no natural passing. Neither do I. Thank you for your honesty. The vicar's hands trembled as Wimsey took his leave. Outside, the rain had settled into a steady patter. The sky now a leaden expanse, the perfect backdrop to the darkening mystery. Returning to the drawing room, Wimsey found Miss Thrip alone, perusing a volume of Shakespeare's tragedies. She looked up with a guarded smile. I trust your interviews have proved fruitful, she said. Indeed, it appears the household is a nest of secrets and silences. Nella's smile faltered. Secrets, yes. But who can say if they are relevant or merely distractions? Sometimes the smallest whisper can unravel the grandest deception. She closed the book with a snap. I cannot help but feel that someone wishes to bury the truth. Wimsey met her gaze. And yet it will rise like smoke from a smouldering fire. He pulled from his pocket the leather-bound notebook he carried, flipping to a page filled with scrawled notes and timelines. Let us examine the chronology once more. Mr. Thrip was last seen alive at approximately 10:15. The mantel clock ceased at 10:17. The footsteps near the library were heard at 10:10 to 10:15. The vicar arrived shortly thereafter. The window was found open, the penciled will missing, and a faint scent of almonds lingered in the air. Nella's eyes narrowed. Each element seems to point in different directions, which suggests a carefully orchestrated misdirection. Her breath caught. You believe someone staged the scene? I do. And more, Whimsy added. The will in pencil indicates desperation, and the missing document implies deliberate concealment. The threads began to knit together, forming a pattern both intricate and unsettling. Whimsy considered the various suspects: Miss Thrip's fragile hope, Bastable's keen interest, the vicar's nervousness, Lumsden's temper, and the silent acquiescence of the servants. All had motives, all had opportunity, yet the truth lay buried beneath layers of deliberate confusion. As twilight deepened, Whimsy resolved to revisit the study at midnight under the cloak of darkness to observe what secrets might be whispered in the absence of eyes. There was a faint chill in the air, but it was not the autumn cold that pricked his skin. It was the electric anticipation of revelation. And as he lit a fresh cigar, the faint curl of smoke wreathed around him like a shroud, promising that the night's investigation would bring the subtle unveiling of hidden truths. Lord Peter Whimsy found himself once more in the shadowed stillness of Sanborn's study at the witching hour. The house, stripped of daytime artifice, revealed its true character. Long corridors, muffled footsteps like whispered confessions, and the very walls seemed to lean in, eager to disclose secrets long held in silent vigil. He had insisted on this nocturnal vigil not merely to catch an errant intruder, but to perceive the subtle rhythms and silences that daylight obscured. The study itself was a chamber of curious contradiction, rich mahogany panels polished to a dim sheen, standing in uneasy harmony with the faint scent of damp earth that seeped from the old stone beneath. The window, which had earlier struck him as odd in its ajar state, was now firmly shut, the latch secure, but not without a slight creak of disuse. Whimsy approached, fingers probing the mechanism with meticulous care. Its alignment was imperfect, a subtle warp in the frame that would have made any attempt at opening from outside more than troublesome. Yet, as he recalled Mrs. Milligan's report, it had been found open on the night of the crime. A faint smile touched his lips. An inconvenient frame, he mused aloud, or a deliberate deceit. From his pocket he withdrew a slender flashlight and swept its beam across the room, illuminating the once overlooked. His gaze fixed on the hearth, where a collection of recently used matches lay discarded, their tips singed to varying degrees. The mantel clock, immaculately crafted but still and silent, arrested his attention next. The hands frozen at 10:17 as previously noted, but it was the fireplace surround that demanded scrutiny. Upon closer examination, Whimsy noticed a peculiar accumulation of fine ash, not the blackened remains of soot, but a delicate powder, almost like the residue of burnt paper. He drew a handkerchief and carefully gathered a sample. Curious, he murmured. Was something incinerated here in haste, or merely an unnoticed byproduct? The stillness was broken by a soft, rustling sound. Whimsy turned sharply, expecting the night's creeping shadows or perhaps the patter of a nocturnal animal. Instead, the door creaked gently ajar, and the figure of Miss Nella Thrip appeared hesitantly in the doorway. "My lord," she whispered, "I could not sleep." "I thought to find you here." He gestured toward a chair. "Please, Miss Thrip, your vigilance is appreciated, though I assure you, the night will reveal its secrets in due time." She seated herself, the dim light casting soft shadows on her face, and watched as Whimsy resumed his inspection, her fingers twisted nervously in her lap. "There is more to this room than meets the eye," Whimsy said softly. "Do you recall, Miss Thrip, if anything was moved or disturbed on that dreadful evening?" Nella's brows furrowed. Only the will. I recall my father clutching it tightly moments before the collapse. But I never saw it afterward. Which brings us to the question of the penciled document itself. A will, written in pencil, a fragile, temporary thing amid the solemnity of ink and parchment. She nodded. It was hastily composed, a matter of weeks before his death. Father feared losing control over his estate. He confided that the penciled will was his safeguard against capricious advisers and greedy relations. And yet it vanished after his passing. Whimsy's eyes glinted. Do you suspect who might have taken it? Her lips pressed into a thin line. Only that there are those who would benefit greatly if the penciled will were never found. Whimsy's mind raced through the roster of interested parties. The nephew Bastable, whose gambling debts were no secret. The vicar, whose precarious financial situation was whispered about among the villagers. Lumsden, the butler with his temper. And the silent servants, each guarding their own versions of truth. I intend to retrieve that will, Whimsy declared. But first there is a detail that has vexed me, a piece of testimony dismissed too readily. He rose and crossed to the desk, opening a drawer to reveal a collection of letters and papers. Extracting one, he turned it so that Nella could see. This letter was found in your father's possession but overlooked during the initial investigation. It bears no signature, but mentions a meeting, a confrontation even, scheduled for the night of his death. Her eyes widened. I never knew of any meeting. Neither did the police, evidently. It reads, the hour approaches when truths must be unveiled. Expect me by the study window at 10. Prepare yourself for what must be faced. The cryptic nature implies a conflict, yet no one was present when your father fell. Nella shivered. Could it have been a trap? Indeed. But by whom and why? The clock in the hall chimed, softly, marking the hour with a hollow note that seemed to echo beyond time itself. Whimsy's gaze shifted toward the door. I believe the answer lies not only in what was said, but in what was left unsaid, the absence of witnesses, the subtle choreography of movements. Do you suspect an accomplice, perhaps, or someone who took pains to construct a facade so convincing that no one questioned it? Her voice trembled slightly. But who would do such a thing? Father was not without enemies, but murder. Whimsy smiled thinly. Murder is the language of desperation, Miss Thrip. When logic is overridden by fear or ambition, even the most genteel souls may be driven to extremes. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps, light, measured, descending the staircase. Whimsy and Nella exchanged a glance as the butler, Lumsden, entered the room, his expression unreadable, but his eyes sharp and calculating. Pardon my intrusion, Lumsden said smoothly. I thought I might find you here, my lord. I wished to inquire if there was anything further you required. Whimsy inclined his head. Your presence is timely, Mr. Lumsden. I was just pondering the movements within the household on the night in question. Might I ask for your own recollections? The butler's jaw tightened imperceptibly. I followed my duties precisely, made my rounds, secured the premises, and retired early. There was nothing unusual. Nothing, you say? Yet, Mrs. Milligan mentioned hearing footsteps near the library after your rounds were complete. A flicker of annoyance crossed Lumsden's face. The house is old and creaks at the slightest provocation. Servants sometimes move about, perhaps restless. Restless servants at a late hour, Whimsy repeated thoughtfully. Yet you were at rest yourself? Indeed. Whimsy's gaze sharpened. Then might I ask, Mr. Lumsden, why did you ask the gardener to come to the study at exactly 10:20 that evening? Lumsden's composure faltered momentarily before he recovered. A matter of maintenance. A window latch needed adjustment. Was it the study window? Yes. And the window found open that night? That I cannot explain. Wimsey saw the subtle tremor in the butler's hands. I see. The three occupants of the room fell into a tense silence, each contemplating the unseen forces at play. The question of the penciled will, the mysterious meeting, the open window, and the scent of almonds formed a lattice of contradictions demanding resolution. Wimsey's mind began to weave these disparate threads into a coherent pattern. The window, difficult to open from outside, the missing will, the timed meeting, the arrival of the vicar, the butler's sudden maintenance task, each an act in a carefully scripted drama. He would need to delve deeper into the household's labyrinthine dynamics, unearth the buried grievances, and dissect the facades worn by each player. And as the night thickened around Sanborn, one certainty remained. The penciled will was not merely a document, but the fulcrum upon which justice would balance. A final measured puff of his cigar, Wimsey prepared to confront the silent house again, poised to unmask the shadowy hand that sought to rewrite fate in pencil. The dawn seeped reluctantly through the heavy curtains of Sanborn House, casting a pallid light upon the somber faces gathered in the drawing-room. The night's vigil had yielded few revelations, but the weight of unspoken truths seemed to press more heavily with the rising sun. Lord Peter Wimsey, standing by the tall, mullioned window, surveyed the assembled household with his customary blend of detachment and purpose. The gears of the mystery were beginning to mesh, though the final mechanism remained elusive. "Miss Thrip," Wimsey began, his voice measured, "it would appear that your father's final hours were less solitary than previously imagined." Nella's eyes narrowed with a flicker of apprehension. "You mean the letter? The one demanding his presence at 10? "Precisely. Yet no one, at least no one admitted to being there." From the far corner, Bastable, the nephew, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His gambler's pallor was now tinged with a sharp edge of frustration. "It's absurd to entertain ghosts," he muttered. "We have tangible proof. The will was never found. Father's wishes are null." Wimsey's gaze flicked to Bastable with a hint of wry amusement. "I am inclined to agree that ghosts are notoriously poor witnesses, though their figurative presence here may be instructive." The vicar, Reverend Cuthbert, cleared his throat. "Surely the matter should be settled on evidence, not spectres." "Indeed," Wimsey replied, "but let us consider what evidence we have. The penciled will, hastily drafted, absent. A meeting foretold but unaccounted for. An open window, unexplainable by natural causes given the frame's resistance to outside interference. Mrs. Milligan, the housekeeper, whose face bore the map of decades of service, spoke softly. "I did hear voices that night, low and urgent, but I dared not intervene." "Voices?" Wimsey's brow arched. "An observation not recorded before, Mrs. Milligan. Could you place their origin?" "Near the study window. It was odd, the way the wind seemed to catch the words, but I only caught fragments." "Fragments often carry more weight than full phrases," Wimsey murmured. He turned his attention to Lumsden, the butler, whose stoic composure had begun to show cracks beneath the strain of suspicion. "Mr. Lumsden, about the window latch you attended to, was there anything unusual in its mechanism?" Lumsden's expression hardened. It was stiff, as is common in this old house, but functional. "Yet it was found open on the night of the murder." "Yes, my lord, which I find perplexing." "Perplexing indeed," Wimsey said, tapping his chin thoughtfully. "Might someone have forced it open?" "Unlikely," Lumsden insisted. "The window's design and the warped frame make it practically immovable from the outside." A silence fell as the implication settled. Wimsey resumed his pacing, hands clasped behind his back. "Then we must consider the possibility of someone already inside, manipulating the environment." The gathering exchanged glances, unease creeping in like a shadow. "Let us recount the timeline," Wimsey proposed, with precision. Pulled forth a worn notebook and began to delineate events, directing his companions to fill in gaps and corroborate times. The household retired to their quarters by 10 p.m., with only the butler and gardener reportedly making rounds, Wimsey stated. Yet Mrs. Milligan's testimony suggests additional movements. Nella interjected. "I was in my room at the eastern wing. I heard the faint murmur of voices, male and female, around 10:15. Voices indeed," Wimsey said, eyes gleaming. "And yet no one admits to being near the study." "Because no one wanted to be seen," Bastable spat. "Or because they wished to hide something far worse than mere presence." "Let us not jump to conclusions," Wimsey cautioned. "Facts first, theories after." He turned again to the butler. "Mr. Lumsden, is there anyone in the household with knowledge of the study's hidden compartments or passages?" The butler's lips thinned. "There is an old cupboard behind the bookcase, a relic from the previous century, but long disused." "Disused or forgotten?" Wimsey mused. The thought prompted Mrs. Milligan to recall. "I once heard Master Bastable whisper to a friend about a secret door that leads from the study to the servants' wing." Bastable flushed with indignation. "Childish tales." "Yet, tales often contain kernels of truth," Wimsey observed. "Might we inspect this cupboard, Mr. Lumsden?" With a reluctant nod, the butler led the way. The party filed into the study, the morning light now revealing details obscured by the gloom of the previous night. The bookcase stood stout and imposing, filled with leather-bound volumes whose spines bore the weight of centuries. Wimsey's deft fingers found the edge of the panel. A barely perceptible seam betrayed the cupboard's true nature. With a soft click, the panel swung open, revealing a narrow passage, its darkness swallowing the light. "A secret corridor," Wimsey whispered. "A hidden route no doubt exploited to orchestrate unseen movements." He retrieved a lantern from the desk and stepped inside, the others hesitating before following. The passage was narrow, lined with stone walls slick with damp. It led directly to the servants' quarters, confirming the whispered rumors. "This explains the unheard comings and goings," Wimsey said, "a clandestine route for those wishing to avoid observation." Nella's face paled. "Who would use this passage?" "Someone with intimate knowledge of the house's secrets," Wimsey replied, "and a motive to remain invisible." They returned to the study, the weight of the revelation settling on them all. Wimsey resumed his chair and drew the penciled will from his coat pocket. "This document, fragile as it is, was clearly the key to the entire mystery." He glanced toward Nella. "May I ask, Miss Thrip, if your father ever confided in you about any particular threats or fears?" She hesitated, then nodded. "He mentioned feeling watched, as if someone waited for him to slip. An adversary who knew the house better than its inhabitants," Wimsey concluded. "One who exploited hidden corridors and imperfect locks." He rose, pacing with renewed energy. "We must reconsider the roles of those closest to the victim. Bastable's debts, the vicar's financial woes, Lumsden's terse demeanour, all points to potential conflict. But the true motive lies deeper. The penciled will," he said, "overrides previous documents, but only if proven authentic." "Forgery?" Bastable's voice cracked. "Possibly," Wimsey said. "Or a desperate attempt to protect an inheritance threatened by external influence." He paused. The meeting foretold in the unsigned letter. What if it was intended not as a confrontation, but as an exchange? "An exchange," Nella echoed. "Yes, perhaps the will was to be handed over or contested under duress or negotiation." "Then the open window," Mrs. Milligan ventured. "A stage signal," Wimsey smiled thinly. "Or a feint to mislead investigators." He looked each person in turn. Our task now is to reconstruct that meeting, identify its participants, and discern the truth behind the penciled will's disappearance. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes as if echoing the turmoil within. Sanborn's walls had concealed the truth for too long. Whimsy flicked his cigar ash into the tray. There are pieces yet unplaced on this board. Soon, they will reveal the picture in full, and the hand that moved them all. With that, he settled back into his chair, eyes alight with the quiet fire of discovery. The game was far from over, and the final act awaited the masterful touch of logic and subtlety he alone could provide. The late afternoon sun cast long golden bars through the tall windows of Sanborn House, painting the dust motes in the air with an eerie calm. Yet within the drawing room the atmosphere was anything but tranquil. The household had been summoned once again, ostensibly for more interviews, though it was clear that Lord Peter Wimsey's mind was turning over unseen cogs and wheels as he prepared to unravel the mystery still shrouded in shadows. "Let us begin with the letter once more," Wimsey said, drawing a crisp sheet from his pocket. "The unsigned summons that brought our unfortunate Mr. Thrip to his end. It is unsigned, but unmistakably penned in a familiar hand." He let the words hang in the charged silence, then smiled thinly. "Miss Thrip, might you remind us who had the clearest access to your father's personal papers?" Nella's fingers tightened nervously on the edge of her chair. "Only myself and Mr. Lumsden, the butler." Lumsden's face, stern and unreadable, betrayed no emotion, though his eyes briefly flicked to the letter. "I merely handled the documents when directed. I assure you, my lord, I would not risk such impropriety." Wimsey's gaze was calm, but unyielding. "Implying risk does not preclude motive, Mr. Lumsden. The question is, who benefited from the disappearance of the penciled will?" Bastable, restless in his seat, shot back. "My uncle left everything to me, according to the last signed document. What motive could anyone have to falsify a will?" "That, sir, is precisely the matter at hand," Wimsey replied, his tone dry. "A will drawn in pencil, unsigned, yet supplanting the last signed official version. Rather an unusual arrangement, no?" "But who would have the audacity to produce such a document?" Nella asked, voice trembling. "Someone desperate." "Or cunning," Wimsey answered, rising to his feet. "Or both." He walked to the mantelpiece, fingers drumming lightly on the carved wood. "Now, to the matter of the secret passage. A device as old as the house itself, but evidently exploited to shroud certain movements in darkness. Surely," the Reverend Cuthbert interjected, "only the servants, or those well-versed in the house's intricacies, would know of such a route." "Indeed. And yet," Wimsey said, turning sharply to Lumsden, "you assured us it was long." "Disused." "I did," the butler agreed, "but the passage is known to some." "To whom, may I ask?" Lumsden's mouth tightened into a thin line. "That I cannot say." Wimsey nodded thoughtfully. "We shall return to that. Meanwhile, Miss Thrip, you mentioned overhearing voices near the study window the night your father was killed. Could you discern any words?" Nella's brow furrowed. "Only fragments. Trust no one. And something about the letter." Then a sharp reply I couldn't catch clearly. "Trust no one," Wimsey mused aloud. "A warning or a threat?" He turned to Bastable, whose impatience was now barely masked. "You were aware of your uncle's doubts regarding his household's loyalty." Bastable's jaw clenched. "My uncle was always paranoid, especially near the end, but that does not implicate me." "Nor the vicar," Wimsey said smoothly, inclining his head toward Reverend Cuthbert. "Yet both of you have your own reasons to desire control over the estate." The vicar's face reddened. "I am but a servant of God, not a schemer of estates." "Of course, Reverend. Still, one must consider the human frailty beneath the cassock. Whimsy's eyes drifted to the now familiar study door. If we are to solve this puzzle, we must test every hypothesis against the cold facts. He directed Bastable to accompany him to the study, and the others were left to await the next development, anxiety quietly thickening the air. Within the study's confines, Whimsy's sharp eyes took in every detail anew. The worn carpet, the scattered papers, the faint but persistent scent of tobacco. He pulled forth the penciled will, held it up to the light, and examined the handwriting closely. Miss Thrip described the letter's handwriting as your father's own, yet unsigned, Whimsy said. But this document bears a more hurried, uncertain hand, one might even say a practiced forgery, Bastable scoffed. Forged by whom? Surely not my uncle himself. Then someone intimately familiar with his mannerisms, Whimsy replied. One who knew how to mimic his hand to cast doubt or confusion. He pulled a leather-bound volume from the desk, its pages yellowed with age. Here, an old ledger kept by your uncle. Note the writing style, neat, deliberate. Contrast it with this will. See the difference? Bastable nodded reluctantly. Yes, the will is careless, almost childlike, which suggests it was drafted in haste or under duress. A document drawn in pencil is inherently temporary, yet here it was meant to supersede all prior wills. It was a trap. But a trap for whom? Bastable asked sharply. Not whom, but what? The inheritance, the control of the estate. Someone wished to unsettle the succession, to create confusion and seize advantage. They heard footsteps approaching and turned to see Lumsden enter, expression grave. My lord, there is one more thing, he said, voice low. The gardener, Mr. Pringle, was found near the servants' quarters late last night, contrary to his statement. He was overheard arguing with someone, a woman. Whimsy's eyes gleamed. Interesting. Miss Thrip, did your father ever mention a gardener he mistrusted? Nella shook her head. No. But the gardener kept to himself. Solitude often breeds secrets, Whimsy mused. He summoned the gardener to the study, where Pringle, a broad-shouldered man with wary eyes, appeared, hesitant. Mr. Pringle, Whimsy began, you were seen near the servants' quarters on the night of the murder. Pringle swallowed. I was, but I assure you, my lord, I was tending to the rose bushes. The moonlight was bright. And the argument? An old woman, Mrs. Hargreaves, came down from the village, claiming my presence was suspicious. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. Did she come alone? No, with another man. I didn't recognize him. Did anyone else see this? Pringle shrugged. Not that I know of. Whimsy exchanged a look with Bastable. So we have a mysterious visitor, an overheard quarrel, and a secret passage. He paced thoughtfully. And a penciled will, unsigned and untrusted. The threads tangled, but the picture remained incomplete. Miss Thrip, Whimsy said softly, your father feared for his safety, believed he was watched, yet confided in no one. What if someone close to him cultivated that fear, manipulated it? Nella's lips trembled. I don't know. Fear is a powerful tool, Whimsy murmured, and control a more potent one. The room grew heavy with the unspoken. Whimsy's gaze fixed on the open window again. There are still unanswered questions. Who left the window open and why? Who summoned your father that night, and who awaited him? Answers that hide in plain sight, he concluded, but only for those willing to look beyond the obvious. Outside, the wind rustled the trees with a whispering insistence, as if urging the truth to surface. Whimsy straightened, a slow smile curling at the corner of his mouth. I think, Miss Thrip, we are close to our next move. The stage is set for a revelation, one that will illuminate the shadows cast by fear and greed alike. And with that, he stepped from the study, leaving the others to ponder the growing web of secrets their fates poised on the cusp of discovery. Whimsy's footsteps echoed softly along the polished oak corridor as he retraced his path toward the servants' quarters. The muted clatter of household activity persisted around Sanborn House, but beneath the veneer of polite conversation and dutiful service, the air was taut with unspoken apprehension. The game was well underway, and every player's move counted. Reaching the servants' hall, Whimsy found himself face to face with Mrs. Hargreaves, the village postmistress, who had been summoned under the pretense of assisting with correspondence. Her face, lined with the marks of many winters, was taut and guarded. Yet when she saw Whimsy, a flicker of recognition and perhaps unease passed through her eyes. "My lord," she began with a cautious curtsy, "I gather you wish to ask about last night's disturbances." "Indeed, Mrs. Hargreaves," Whimsy replied, his tone courteous but incisive. "It has come to my attention that you confronted the gardener, Mr. Pringle, near these quarters late at night." "Not confrontation, exactly," she demurred. "More of a warning. There are whispers in the village, you see. People talk of shadows moving where none should be, and my conscience would not suffer me to ignore them." "Shadows," Whimsy murmured, his gaze narrowing. "Curious word choice. And the man who accompanied you, did you learn his identity?" Mrs. Hargreaves hesitated, fingers twisting a handkerchief. "I did not, my lord. He was a stranger to me." Strange men arriving unannounced, Whimsy reflected aloud, often herald complications. He thanked her and excused himself, retracing his steps toward the library, a vast chamber of polished shelves and worn leather bindings. Here the quiet was absolute save for the ticking of a grand clock, one of several in the house, all set to slightly different times, an inconsistency Whimsy had already catalogued with interest. In the shadowed recesses of the library, Bastable awaited, fidgeting with a silver cigarette case. "Are we any closer to discovering who murdered my uncle?" he demanded. "Closer," Whimsy replied, "yet the closer one gets to the truth, the more intricate the web appears." Bastable snorted. "I'd rather have a simple, straightforward answer." "Ah, but simplicity is rarely the friend of justice." Whimsy's eyes danced with wry amusement.
"Tell me, Mr. Bastable, you claim no knowledge of your uncle's personal affairs beyond the signed will?" "None. I was surprised to hear of this penciled document. I never saw it until today. Were you aware that your uncle had been
unsettled of late? That he believed some among his household could not be trusted?" Bastable's face twitched, a shadow of something unreadable passing across his features. He was prone to bouts of suspicion. But what use is paranoia to us now? Perhaps more than you think. Whimsy's tone grew serious. "I have been pondering the timing of the murder, the precise moments that placed each person in the house, and the curious discrepancy in the clocks. One was set 10 minutes slow, another fast, creating a temporal smokescreen." Bastable frowned. "Clocks are hardly proof of murder." "Not alone," Whimsy agreed, "but when combined with the secret passage and the whispered warnings, they paint a picture. The victim's death was no random act, but a carefully orchestrated event." He motioned toward the fireplace, where a framed portrait of the late Mr. Thrip hung. The man's eyes, stern and sharp, seemed to regard them with a silent reproach. Whimsy continued, "There is, however, one person whose presence remains curiously unaccounted for during the crucial hour." Bastable's brow arched. "Who?" "Mrs. Hargreaves herself. You see, the village postmistress is an essential cog in the machinery of communication. Letters come and go under her watchful eye. A mistress of secrets." Bastable shook his head, in disbelief. "Are you suggesting she is involved?" "Not yet," Whimsy replied, "but consider, she arrives late, accompanied by a stranger. She warns the gardener against roaming. She invokes shadows and suspicion. And yet, when questioned, she offers no solid alibi." Bastable scoffed again. "This is hardly evidence." "No," Whimsy agreed, but it is a thread worth pulling. At that moment, Lumsden appeared, face drawn. "My lord, Miss Thrip, wishes to speak with you." In the parlour, Nella awaited, her composure fragile but determined. "My lord," she said quietly, "I have been thinking about what you said, that my father's fear may have been cultivated." "Yes?" "I remember. Now, just before his death, he received a letter hastily delivered by a messenger I did not recognize." Whimsy's interest sharpened. "A messenger unknown to the household?" Nella nodded. "Yes, and I overheard part of the conversation between my father and the messenger. It was terse, almost threatening." "Did you see the letter?" "I did, but only glimpsed the envelope. It was sealed with a simple wax stamp, unremarkable. Did your father show it to you?" "No. He seemed deeply troubled, but said only that it was nothing to be concerned about." Whimsy's eyes glittered. "Nothing, or everything?" He turned to Bastable. "Have you any idea who might have sent such a message?" Bastable was silent. Whimsy paced thoughtfully. "We must locate this letter." He left the room, intent on searching the study once more. There, behind a stack of papers, he found a small envelope, torn open but with wax residue still clinging to the flap. Examining it, he noted the faint, almost imperceptible impression of a symbol pressed into the wax, a stylized serpent entwined around a letter S. "Curious," Whimsy mused, "a symbol familiar yet out of place." He pocketed the envelope and returned to the gathering in the drawing room. "My friends," he said, "we are uncovering a scheme more complex than mere avarice. The late Mr. Thrip was ensnared in a web woven by someone skilled in deception, someone who understood not only the law but the psychology of fear. He fixed each of them in turn with a steady gaze. The forged will was a red herring designed to mislead. The secret passage was a conduit for clandestine meetings and messages. The clocks, deliberately altered, served to distort the timeline. The gardener and the postmistress were unwitting pawns in a larger game. "But who benefits?" Bastable asked, voice tense. "Control of the estate is the obvious prize," Whimsy said. "Yet there is something deeper. Revenge cloaked beneath civility, a grudge festering beneath the surface of propriety." He paused, then added with a hint of dry irony, "And as in all good mysteries, it is often those closest to the victim who hold the darkest motives." Outside, the twilight deepened, shadows creeping like fingers across the manicured lawns. Whimsy stood still, the gears of deduction grinding smoothly within his mind. The final act draws near, and when the curtain falls, we shall see not ghosts, but men and women laid bare by their own making. He glanced once more toward the study window, still ajar. The truth waits behind that frame, as elusive as ever, but not for long. As the final veil of dusk slipped away from Sanborn House, the gathered company assembled once more in the grand drawing-room, their faces a gallery of restrained anxiety and polite curiosity. Lord Peter Whimsy, the epitome of unruffled composure, stood at the hearthside, the faint glow of the fire casting flickering shadows that seemed almost to animate the mysteries he was about to unravel. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice measured and deliberate, "we have traversed a maze of half-truths, misdirection, and carefully crafted deceit. Tonight, I intend to illuminate the path from shadow to certainty." He paused, allowing the silence to settle like a mantle. The late Mr. Thrip's demise, though cruel in execution, was not born of happenstance, nor is it the work of a stranger lurking beyond these walls. Rather, it is the consequence of human frailty, pride, fear, and a need to control what must inevitably slip through one's grasp. Whimsy's gaze swept across the room, resting briefly on each individual, on the tight-lipped Bastable, on Mrs. Hargreaves's faintly tremulous countenance, on the pale, watchful Nella. Let us consider the forged will, the document penciled in a hurried hand, intended to unsettle and confuse. The motive behind it was not mere financial gain, but manipulation of trust within the household. The alteration of the clocks served to disguise the true timeline of events, creating a convenient alibi for one. He approached the window, now fully closed, fingers tracing its frame as if unlocking an invisible door. The secret passage, though reputed to be a relic of Gothic romance, was exploited as a means of clandestine movement. Only someone intimately familiar with the house's architecture could have utilized it so efficiently. Turning back to face them, Whimsy's eyes gleamed with the final key. Mrs. Hargreaves, your late-night arrival, accompanied by an unknown stranger, was no mere happenstance. You sought to deliver a message, a warning, or perhaps a threat to silence the gardener, Mr. Pringle. Yet your loyalty to this household is evident. You are not the architect of this tragedy, but a courier, compelled by loyalty or fear. The postmistress inclined her head in cautious acknowledgement. To Mr. Bastable, Whimsy continued, your protests of ignorance strain credulity. You inherited much, yet your temper and impatience suggested deeper resentment. Your visits to the study that evening were not casual. You were aware of your uncle's letter, the one sealed with the serpent's insignia, and you feared its contents. A faint flush rose on Bastable's cheeks, but he said nothing. The letter, Whimsy said, revealed the existence of a secret agreement, a second marriage, a hidden heir. It was this knowledge that fueled a desperate attempt to control the inheritance. The forged will was an instrument of this ambition. Whimsy paused, then fixed his gaze on Nella Thrip. And you, Miss Thrip, your overheard conversation with the messenger, the vague threats, these were the last tendrils of a dying man's fear. Your father sought to protect you from a family, secret he hoped would never see the light. Yet the truth was too heavy to bear alone. The room seemed to constrict, breaths held in collective anticipation. The murder was committed by none other than Mr. Pringle, the gardener, a man whose loyalty was tested beyond endurance. He discovered the forged will and feared the consequences for the household he had long served. Acting on impulse rather than malice, he intended to confront your uncle, only to be caught in the tragic swirl of events. Pringle, who had stood silently near the doorway, his shoulders stooped under the weight of revelation, now spoke with a voice roughened by remorse. It was never my intent to kill my lord, only to warn him, to stop the madness before it consumed us all. Whimsy inclined his head, the faintest smile touching his lips. Human motivations are rarely simple, Mr. Pringle, but justice must be served. He turned to the assembled company once more. Let this be a reminder that beneath the polished surfaces of civility and order, there reside passions and fears as primal as any storm. It is the detective's task to navigate these turbulent waters, guided not by superstition but by reason and keen observation. As the household absorbed the revelation, Whimsy lit a cigar with his characteristic flourish, the amber glow a small beacon of calm in the charged atmosphere. Now, if you will excuse me, I shall retire to my chambers to contemplate the curious ways of human nature, and perhaps indulge in a well-earned dram. With that, Lord Peter Whimsy strode from the room, leaving behind a circle of minds unsettled but enlightened, the mysteries of Sandbourne House laid bare beneath the cold light of logic and the faintest wisp of British irony.